There can be no denying that the Switch has cemented itself as a hugely successful new venture for Nintendo, breaking record after record for first year sales. But something which keeps cropping up in discussions about the system is frustration about the number of ports we're seeing, particularly of first-party Wii U games. I can't deny the Switch is plundering many of the Wii U's best games for an early push of quality titles, but it's this frustration which has me confused. Having followed Nintendo for many years and enjoyed their games over many console generations, to me these ports and remasters are far from a surprise. Ports and remasters have been a staple of Nintendo's business since the very beginning. I think it's high time we take a flying tour through Nintendo's long history with ports, remasters and re-releases, and ease our minds that ports and remasters have been an ever-present part of the Nintendo we know and love. To quickly define these terms, a port is a re-release of a game in its near original form, with at most very minor changes made to the game itself. A remaster is where the original game is used as a foundation, but moderate to large overall changes are made, most frequently in the visuals, but also potentially in the gameplay or content of the game itself. Finally, a remake is where the original game serves only as a conceptual basis for a newly developed game, often with huge changes to the visuals, game design, or content, but all while still retaining the core concepts, ideas, and general feel of the original. While Switch ports may be the current hot topic, Nintendo's penchant for porting games far predates the Switch. During its early years in the home console market, Nintendo served up a whole host of ports and remakes of their popular arcade games onto the Nintendo Entertainment System. Donkey Kong, Donkey Kong 3, Donkey Kong Jr. and Mario Bros. Were among the early headline titles for the system. The ability to play these fan-favourite arcade games from the comfort of your own home was a major selling point. We also saw titles like Punch-Out!, which, although not direct ports, were remakes inspired by existing arcade titles which the NES couldn't handle directly. It's clear then that Nintendo's roots in the home console market are built firmly on a foundation of arcade to NES ports and remakes. With the release of the Super Nintendo in 1990 and the push into the 16-bit generation, many third parties continued this trend of arcade ports, with Street Fighter II ruling the roost. Nintendo, though, took a different approach to re-releases in this generation. A prime example of this was Super Mario All-Stars. This game took all three Super Mario Bros. Titles from the NES, gave them a new lick of paint, and bundled them together for a new generation of gamers to enjoy, in the process setting the precedent for remasters for decades to come. We saw a slightly different approach with Kirby Superstar, a game which is comprised of many smaller games and modes. The Spring Breeze mode was a simplified remake of the Game Boy original Kirby's Dream Land, but with enhanced graphics and gameplay elements. We also saw a few games coming to the Super Nintendo following initial Game Boy or NES releases, such as the puzzle titles Yoshi's Cookie and Dr. Mario, bundled along with Tetris. Speaking of the Game Boy, while the NES and Super Nintendo saw their fair share of ports and remakes, it's on their handhelds that Nintendo have relied most heavily on these to provide a compelling library of games. Early in the Game Boy's life, Nintendo re-released several classic NES games for the system, complete with new features, graphics and design elements. These titles included tennis, golf, baseball and Dr. Mario, with varying degrees of reworked visuals and gameplay tweaks to accommodate being ported to the Game Boy. A number of compilation titles drawing from Nintendo's previous handheld heritage were also released on the Game Boy. Game & Watch Gallery 1 and 2 gathered together a broad collection of games from Nintendo's Game & Watch systems for Game Boy owners to enjoy. These titles include two different gameplay modes. All included games could be played in Classic mode, presenting players with faithful, direct ports of the Game & Watch titles with original visuals, but these collections also include a modern mode for some of the included games, giving each an entirely new aesthetic featuring characters from the Super Mario Bros. Series. The Game Boy also saw the release of Donkey Kong 94. This title initially looks to be a straight remake of the original arcade Donkey Kong. The game starts with the 4 classic Donkey Kong stages, but this title pushes far beyond the scope of the original, including a whopping 97 further stages. This title then is a remake in every sense of the word, with this game including everything we saw in the original Donkey Kong. But the sheer scope of the additions beyond this are hugely impressive, crafting a fundamentally new title atop this arcade classic. This was also the first game to take full advantage of the Super NES Super Game Boy add-on, which allows a game to be displayed with colour and even with an arcade cabinet surrounding when played on your television. Perhaps the highest profile remaster on the Game Boy was 1999's Pokemon Yellow. This game took everything we knew and loved about 1998's Pokemon Red and Blue and added lots of references to the hugely popular Pokemon anime series. Pikachu is the player's new starter Pokemon, following you around for the entirety of the game. The sprites for all 151 Pokemon were redrawn to match the designs in the anime, and an array of small tweaks were made to the overall game experience to satisfy returning fans. This has since set the precedent for the series, with third versions being a long-running theme for the hugely popular games. Following the launch of the Game Boy Color in 1998, Nintendo released The Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening DX, a remastering of the Game Boy original. This game boasted the addition of colour visuals to the game, alongside the inclusion of an entirely new dungeon, which used this newfound colour as a major element of all its puzzles, something which was simply not possible on the monochrome original. This remaster also included compatibility with the long-forgotten Game Boy printer, allowing players to print out pictures of Link from across the game world. The Super Nintendo classic Donkey Kong Country also saw a port onto the system in 2000, with Rare pulling off a small miracle to get the game running so well on the system. Then, who can forget 1999's Super Mario Bros. Deluxe? An enhanced port of the NES original, Deluxe integrated several additions and improvements to the NES game, including a new multiplayer mode which was recently celebrated in 2017's Nintendo World Championship. This remaster included a world map for the game, and the forgiving ability to save at any time. The Game Boy Color also hosted the third entry in the Game & Watch Gallery series, bringing more classic Game & Watch action for fans old and new to enjoy, along with the returning modern mode, with remastered visuals for a handful of the included games. Finally, the Game Boy Color saw the release of Pokemon Crystal, a remastered version of Pokemon Gold and Silver. This game pushed beyond the additions of Yellow by including not just updated visuals and gameplay, but new story elements centered around Suicune. Crystal was the first game in the series where you could play as a female character, and the first game to include animated sprites when entering a battle. An interesting point of discussion here, in the midst of an early heritage of ports, is the Nintendo 64. This is perhaps the only Nintendo system where nearly every game was brand new, with only Dr. Mario 64 maintaining the lineage of enhanced ports on the system. It's hard to pinpoint exactly why this is, but perhaps it's a result of the industry's direction in this era. Real-time computer graphics were the new breakthrough, and this major revolution in consoles' power and graphical prowess meant 3D characters and worlds to explore were the order of the day, leaving little appetite for the pixel art of years gone by. Even titles like Star Fox 64, which undoubtedly set out as a knowing nod to the Super Nintendo original, forged their own unique path in this generation. This quiet period for home console ports and remasters, however, would be short-lived. Early on in the GameCube's life, we saw the release of the quirky god simulator, Doshin the Giant. While a new game for the Western market, this was actually a slightly enhanced port of a Japan-exclusive title from the ill-fated Nintendo 64 DD. Animal Crossing on the GameCube shares a similar heritage, also being a hugely enhanced remaster of Animal Forest, a Japan-exclusive Nintendo 64 game. We also saw some direct ports of Nintendo's 64 titles in the form of the 2 Zelda bonus discs, which released on the GameCube. The first was a pre-order bonus for The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker. This disc included the original version of The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time, alongside the never-before-released remastering of the title, Master Quest. The second of these discs is the now much sought-after standalone Zelda Collector's Edition disc, which includes direct ports of the NES titles Zelda and Zelda 2, alongside both N64 titles, Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask. Not all the ports on the GameCube had their origins on the Nintendo 64 though, with WarioWare Inc. Mega Party Games being a remastered version of the Game Boy Advance original, including upgraded visuals and more multiplayer capability. While it's clear that the trend for ports and remasters was once again present in the GameCube era, this was pushed to the extreme on the Game Boy Advance. Prior to its launch, early indications hinted at a console able to handle games comparable to the Super Nintendo, and Nintendo definitely doubled down on that connection. Perhaps the most popular remasters on the Game Boy Advance were the 4 entries in the Super Mario Advance series. 2001's Super Mario Advance included the Super Mario All-Stars version of Super Mario Bros. 2, with a few changes such as altered bosses and the inclusion of a new point scoring system. This title also bundled in a second game, a remake of the original Mario Bros. Including updated 16-bit visuals. Super Mario Advance 2 soon followed in 2002, a ported version of the SNES classic Super Mario World. This title saw fewer changes from the original, though did include Luigi as an optional character, with physics matching those seen in Super Mario Advance 1. 2002 also saw the release of Super Mario Advance 3, this time a port of the Super Nintendo classic Super Mario World 2 Yoshi's Island, including 6 new levels and sound effects from Yoshi's N64 entry, Yoshi's Story. Finally, 2003 brought the fourth and final entry in the Super Mario Advance series, with a ported version of Super Mario Bros. 3, again taking assets from the Super Mario All-Stars version of the game. This version also included a whole new world of levels, which were unlocked using specific e-reader cards. This is just the tip of the iceberg with Game Boy Advance ports though. A 12-title collection of classic NES games were also released for the system, including Donkey Kong, Dr. Mario, Super Mario Bros. And many more, with further titles released exclusively in Japan. Many of these NES games were also released in card form for use with the ill-fated e-reader accessory, so Nintendo were offering plenty of ways to get your Game Boy Advance NES game fix. The Game Boy Advance also saw ports for all three Donkey Kong Country games from the Super Nintendo, a port of The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, including a new multiplayer game, Four Swords. Throw in the fact that the Game Boy Advance Mario Kart Super Circuit built heavily upon the Mode 7 original on the Super Nintendo, and also included all of Super Mario Kart's tracks as unlockable bonuses, and it's clear that Nintendo were pushing ports and remakes like they never had done before. And of course we saw the final entry into the Game & Watch Gallery series with Game & Watch Gallery Advance, completing the Game Boy family's compendium of Game & Watch classics. Continuing the lineage from Pokemon Yellow and Crystal, the Game Boy Advance Pokemon entries Ruby and Sapphire also received a remastered third version in the form of Pokemon Emerald. This title once again pushed the scope of Pokemon remasters, including updates to the visuals and gameplay, along with new story elements, and most notably a hugely expanded postgame in the form of the Battle Frontier, which featured a number of new arenas where the player can test their Pokemon against new and powerful trainers. The Game Boy Advance also brought the advent of more fully featured remakes. At the launch of the Game Boy Advance, Nintendo had been a major player in the video game market for over 16 years, so they had a wealth of existing titles from which they could draw inspiration. The definitive examples of this are 2004's Pokemon titles, Pokemon Fire Red and Leaf Green. These titles set out to recreate the original Pokemon adventure fans knew and loved, incorporating all the series advances over the years since the original games, and all 386 Pokemon which existed at the time, while giving players the chance to catch their favourite Kanto Pokemon to use in Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire. Finally, we also saw a remake of the classic NES Metroid entry in the form of Metroid Zero Mission, providing a new generation and much easier entry into where the series began, and in the process crafting a fan favourite game. And with that, we come to the end of part 1 of our tour through Nintendo's long history of ports, remakes and remasters. Thank you so much for watching. Be sure to keep an eye out for part 2 coming soon, where we explore Nintendo's ports and remakes from the DS through to the present day. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like it and subscribe to the channel to be the first to see every new video.